David sat alone in his small apartment, the dim glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the city had fallen silent, except for the occasional hum of a passing car. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic purring of Whiskers, his loyal tabby cat, curled up beside him on the couch. At 65, David had grown used to the solitude. Ever since his wife passed away 5 years ago and his children moved to different states, his world had shrunk to the walls of his modest home. But he wasn't entirely alone. Whiskers had been his constant companion, his little shadow, always by his side, always watching him with those bright green eyes that seemed to understand far more than any ordinary cat should. Tonight, however, Whiskers wasn't his usual calm self. He kept shifting uncomfortably, his tail flicking restlessly as he stared at David, as if sensing something was wrong. David sighed, rubbing his temples. He had been feeling unwell all day, lightheaded, slightly disoriented, and strangely fatigued. His left arm had been tingling since the afternoon, but he brushed it off as a sign of old age. Probably just low blood pressure, he muttered, reaching for the glass of water on the table. As he tried to take a sip, his grip suddenly failed. The glass slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the floor and shattering into a dozen pieces. Whiskers jumped up, his ears twitching at the sound. His gaze darted to David, who now sat frozen, his breathing shallow. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as an intense wave of dizziness washed over him. Then, without warning, his chest tightened. A searing pain shot down his left arm. The world spun. His body slumped sideways, and before he could even call for help, he collapsed onto the floor. Whiskers sprang into action. He ran to David, nudging his face with his tiny nose, meowing frantically. But David didn't respond. His eyes fluttered half open, unfocused, his lips slightly parted as he struggled to breathe. The silence in the room felt suffocating. The only movement was Whiskers pacing around his owner, his small paws trembling. The cat didn't understand human words, but he understood something was terribly, terribly wrong. He had never seen David like this before, so still, so lifeless. Desperate, Whiskers pawed at David's chest, then at his face, hoping to wake him up. Nothing. He let out a sorrowful, high-pitched meow that echoed through the empty apartment. And then, as if guided by instinct, his gaze landed on the telephone sitting on the nearby table. Whiskers remembered something. David often used that strange object to talk to people. It made sounds. It connected him to others. The cat's ears perked up. A flicker of determination sparked in his eyes. He leapt onto the table, his tiny paws pressing against the smooth buttons. His tail swayed anxiously as he sniffed at the keypad. He had seen David press these before. Random movements always made it beep. With a deep breath, Whiskers pressed his paw onto the buttons. A tone rang out. Another press. Another beep. 9. Another tap. 1. One more. 1. The phone connected. A faint voice crackled through the speaker. 911, what's your emergency? Silence. Then a desperate, pleading meow filled the receiver. The call had gone through. But was it enough? The emergency dispatcher frowned as she heard the open line. 911, can you hear me? She repeated, waiting for a response. But the only sound was soft, frantic meowing. She hesitated. Was this a prank call? A mistake? It wouldn't be the first time. Pets had been known to accidentally dial emergency services, but something about this call felt different. The meows weren't playful or random, they were desperate. She turned to her colleague. There's no human response, but I hear a distressed animal. The line is open. Should I trace the address? The supervisor nodded. If the call stays connected and there's no voice response, we should send a unit just in case. Meanwhile, inside the apartment, Whiskers didn't know he had just done something extraordinary. He only knew that David wasn't moving and he needed help. The cat leapt off the table and ran back to David, nudging his hand with his nose. Nothing. The old man's chest rose and fell in slow, uneven breaths, his face pale and clammy. Whiskers' heart pounded. He meowed again, louder this time, his tail puffed up in distress. Minutes passed. The phone, still on the table, crackled with faint sounds of operators speaking in the background. Then, in the distance, Whiskers heard something. A faint wailing sound. It grew louder. Closer. Sirens. The cat rushed to the door, his ears twitching at the approaching noise. He didn't understand what it was, but something inside him told him that help was coming. Outside, 2 paramedics rushed up the apartment steps. They had been briefed that the call was unusual, no human voice, just an open line and a cat meowing, but they weren't about to take any chances. Apartment 3B, one of them read aloud. Registered to a David Collins, age 65. History of mild hypertension. No answer when we called back. They knocked on the door. No response. They knocked harder. Still nothing. Sir? This is emergency services. We received a call from this number. Inside, Whiskers ran to the door and let out a sharp, urgent meow. His paws scratched against the wood as if trying to open it himself. One of the paramedics pressed his ear against the door. I hear movement inside. An animal. The other paramedic looked at their partner, then at the locked door. If he's unconscious, we can't wait. Breaching now. They forced the door open. The sight that greeted them was both unusual and heartbreaking. David lay sprawled on the floor, unresponsive, his skin pale with a bluish tinge. Standing over him was a small, wide-eyed tabby cat, his fur bristling as he protectively hovered near his owner. Sir, can you hear me? One of the paramedics immediately dropped to his knees, checking for a pulse. The other stared at the landline phone on the table, still connected to the 911 line. His gaze then shifted to the cat. You don't think? The first paramedic exhaled in disbelief. I don't know, but that little guy just might have saved his life. Whiskers, sensing movement, let out a small chirp. He backed away as the paramedics worked, his worried eyes never leaving David. Pulse is weak, breathing irregular. We need to move fast. Within seconds they had stabilized David, preparing him for transport. Whiskers let out a small, anxious trill as they lifted his owner onto the stretcher. One of the paramedics hesitated before kneeling beside the cat. He scratched Whiskers gently behind the ear. You did good, little guy. You did real good. But Whiskers didn't care about praise. He just wanted his human back. As the paramedics rushed David out of the apartment, Whiskers made a move to follow, but the door shut in his face. For the first time in his life he was alone. His tail drooped. He stared at the closed door, his ears twitching at the fading sound of sirens. Would David ever come back? The apartment had never felt this empty before. Whiskers sat by the door, his ears perked up, waiting for any sign of David's return. But all he heard was silence. No familiar footsteps, no gentle voice calling his name, no warm lap to curl into. The minutes stretched into hours. Whiskers paced around the room, his tail low. He sniffed at the blanket on the couch where David usually sat, his scent still lingering. He rubbed his face against it, trying to find comfort, but it wasn't the same. The night deepened and hunger gnawed at his belly, but he didn't touch his food. He didn't want to eat. He didn't want to sleep. He only wanted David. He jumped onto the windowsill, looking out into the night. Somewhere out there, his human was alone, just like him. His green eyes reflected the streetlights below as he let out a small, mournful meow. Would David ever come back? At the hospital, David was fighting for his life. The doctors confirmed he had suffered a stroke. He had been lucky. If the call hadn't been made in time, he might not have survived. But though his body was stable, he hadn't regained consciousness. The nurses monitored him carefully. His children had been contacted, but they lived states away and wouldn't arrive until morning. For now, David was alone. Except, the hospital staff kept talking about something strange. The dispatcher had reported that the 911 call came from an open line, with no human voice, only a cat meowing. And when the paramedics arrived, the cat had been the only one there. It was an unbelievable story. Could an animal really understand enough to make a call for help? One of the nurses shook her head as she checked David's vitals. If that cat hadn't done whatever it did, he wouldn't have made it. But even as they worked to save David's life, they didn't realize that back at his apartment, Whiskers was struggling too. The next morning, the apartment remained eerily silent. Whiskers hadn't moved from his spot near the door. His food bowl remained untouched. His fur looked slightly ruffled, his usual grooming forgotten. Then footsteps. His ears perked up. He jumped up instantly, his heart racing. The door unlocked. But it wasn't David. A woman stepped inside, a neighbor who had been contacted by David's son. She was here to check on the cat. Hey there, little one, she said softly, bending down. I heard you've been through a lot. Whiskers took a step back, his tail twitching uncertainly. The woman sighed, looking around. Poor thing, you must be so confused. She filled his food bowl with fresh kibble and changed his water, but Whiskers barely looked at it. She tried to pet him, but he turned away, his ears drooping. David was still missing. The woman stayed for a while, watching him. She had heard the incredible story, the cat that had somehow dialed 911. But right now he just looked lost. Don't worry, she whispered. David's a fighter. He'll come back for you. Whiskers didn't understand her words. But deep inside he clung to the only thing he had left, hope. And so he waited. David's world was dark. He wasn't fully conscious, yet somewhere deep inside he felt trapped. His mind drifted between memories, faint whispers of laughter, the sound of the television in his apartment, the warmth of a small body curled up beside him. But something was wrong. He felt heavy, unable to move, unable to speak. He wasn't sure where he was. All he knew was that something was missing. Whiskers. A part of him longed to wake up, to reach out and feel the soft fur of his little companion. But his body refused to obey. He was sinking. Distant voices echoed around him, but they were muffled, just out of reach. He wanted to call out, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Was this it? Was this the end? Meanwhile, back at the apartment, Whiskers was still waiting. Days had passed. The neighbor visited daily to feed him, but he barely ate. At night, he curled up on David's bed, where his scent still lingered. It was the only comfort he had left. But something inside him told him not to give up. David was out there somewhere. And he needed to come home. One morning, as the neighbor came in with fresh food, Whiskers suddenly darted past her and ran toward the door. "Whoa, hey," she called, startled. "Where are you going?" But Whiskers didn't stop. His little paws pounded against the apartment floor as he rushed down the hallway. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to find David. The neighbor ran after him. "Wait. You can't just run off like that." But Whiskers was determined. He rushed down the building stairs and out the front door, his heart racing. And then he froze. The outside world was bigger than he had ever known. Cars rumbled past. People moved quickly, lost in their own lives. The air smelled different, unfamiliar. For the first time, doubt crept in. Could he really find David? The neighbor finally caught up, scooping him up before he could run any farther. "Whiskers," she sighed, holding him close. "I know you miss him." The little cat let out a small, pitiful meow, his ears flattening. She held him for a long moment before finally whispering, "I have an idea." That afternoon, Whiskers found himself in a place he had never been before. The hospital. The neighbor had pulled some strings, explaining the unusual story to the staff. And though they had never allowed pets in this way before, they made an exception. "Let's see if this helps," the nurse said as she led them toward David's room. As soon as the door opened, Whiskers' ears perked up. The scent, faint but familiar, was here. "David." The little cat wriggled out of the neighbor's arms and leaped onto the bed in one swift motion. And there he was. David lay still, his face pale, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. He looked so different from the strong, kind man Whiskers knew. Whiskers hesitated, then slowly crept forward. His small paws pressed gently against David's chest as he sniffed his face. He let out a soft, questioning meow. No response. He nudged David's hand with his nose. Nothing. Whiskers' heart sank. He curled up against his owner's side, his little body pressing into him as if trying to wake him up with warmth. David didn't move. Whiskers let out a long, sorrowful cry, the sound echoing in the quiet hospital room. And then, a twitch. A slight movement of fingers. The nurse gasped. "Did you see that?" Whiskers lifted his head, his green eyes wide. David's fingers moved again, ever so slightly. His breathing hitched. His eyelids fluttered. Whiskers let out another small meow, hopeful this time. And then, weak and barely above a whisper. A single word. "Whiskers?" David's voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was there. Whiskers' ears perked up. He let out a tiny meow, nudging David's hand again. David's fingers twitched once more. His eyelids fluttered, his body stirring slightly. The heart monitor beeped a little faster. The nurse leaned in, her eyes wide. "David? Can you hear me?" David's lips parted slightly, but no real words came out. His breathing was uneven, his body still struggling to wake. Whiskers didn't move from his side. He pressed his little head against David's chest, the warmth of his small body a quiet reminder that he was there, that he had never left. The nurse turned to the neighbor. "This is incredible. He's responding." The neighbor watched, shaking her head in amazement. "I don't think I've ever seen anything like this." The nurse gently squeezed David's hand. "David, if you can hear me, try to move your fingers again." There was a pause. Then, ever so slightly, his fingers curled. Weak, slow, but deliberate. Tears welled in the nurse's eyes. She turned quickly, pressing the call button for the doctor. Whiskers stayed still, his green eyes fixed on David's face. His ears twitched at every little movement, every shift in David's breath. He was waking up. An hour passed, then another. David was still weak, still barely able to move, but his eyes had opened for the first time. His gaze was unfocused, confused. His body was heavy, sluggish, but he was awake. The doctor checked his vitals, noting every small improvement. He's making progress. This is a very good sign. David's lips trembled as he tried to form words. His voice was nothing more than a hoarse whisper. Where? The doctor leaned in. You're in the hospital, David. You had a stroke. David's brows furrowed. His mind was slow, struggling to process. But then he felt it. A small, warm weight against his chest. Soft fur brushing against his hospital gown. A familiar scent. He shifted his gaze downward, and there he was. Whiskers. His little cat curled up against him, watching him with those big green eyes. David swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his voice barely there. But he managed one word. Buddy. Whiskers let out a tiny meow in response, as if he had been waiting for this moment. David tried to lift his hand, but the movement was slow, clumsy. His fingers barely brushed against Whiskers' fur. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. You. His voice cracked. He could barely speak, but he didn't need to. The tears slipping down his weathered face said everything. The nurse smiled softly. Your cat never gave up on you, David. You waited. He came here to see you. David swallowed again, his throat tight with emotion. A flicker of memory surfaced in his mind, the moment before everything went dark. The dizziness, the fall, the desperate realization that he couldn't move, couldn't speak. And then, the phone. The vague memory of Whiskers on the counter. His tiny paws pressing buttons. David's breath hitched. Had Whiskers really? His mind was still foggy, but the truth settled deep in his heart. His cat had saved him. Whiskers purred softly, pressing his head against David's chest. A silent reassurance. David exhaled shakily. Good boy. He closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. But this time it wasn't the same empty darkness. This time there was light. David's body was weak, but his heart was full. The days passed in slow, careful steps. He was still in the hospital, but the doctors were optimistic. The stroke had taken its toll, leaving his right side partially paralyzed. Speaking was difficult, movement even more so. But he was alive. And he wasn't alone. Whiskers stayed with him every moment the hospital allowed. When visiting hours ended, the neighbor took him home, but every morning he returned, curling up beside David as if afraid to leave him again. David lived for those moments. His voice was hoarse, his words slurred, but he spoke to Whiskers anyway. Guess I owe you, huh? Whiskers purred in response as if he understood every word. The nurses were amazed. I've never seen a cat so devoted, one of them said, watching as Whiskers sat beside David's hand, nudging it gently, encouraging movement. David saw it too. The doctors had said recovery would be slow, frustrating. There would be therapy, struggles, moments when he would want to give up. But how could he? His little cat had never given up on him. So he pushed forward. The first time he moved his fingers fully, Whiskers was there, rubbing against his hand in encouragement. The first time he sat up on his own, Whiskers jumped onto his lap, purring in approval. The first time he took a shaky step with the help of a nurse, Whiskers trotted beside him, his tail high in the air. Every small victory, every inch of progress, Whiskers was there. David smiled more. He fought harder. Because if his cat could believe in him, then maybe he could believe in himself too. One afternoon the doctor sat beside him, reviewing his chart. You're improving faster than we expected, David, she said with a small smile. Your progress is remarkable. David chuckled weakly. Maybe, it's my doctor. The doctor raised an eyebrow, confused. David gestured slowly to the little cat curled up beside him. Best therapist I've had. The doctor laughed softly. I think you might be right. She paused, then spoke more seriously. We're going to start preparing you for discharge soon. You'll still need therapy, but you can continue your recovery at home. Home. The word felt foreign after so much time in the hospital. Would things ever feel normal again? He looked down at Whiskers, who was staring up at him with those bright green eyes. Yes. As long as they were together, home would feel right again. A few days later, the moment finally came. David sat in a wheelchair as the nurse pushed him through the hospital doors. He had a long road ahead, weeks, months of therapy, of learning to walk properly again, of training his body to move the way it used to. But he wasn't afraid. Because in his lap, curled up like he belonged there, was Whiskers. The neighbor smiled as she held the car door open. Ready to go home? David ran a shaky hand through Whiskers' fur. Yeah, he whispered. Let's go home. The car ride home was quiet except for the gentle hum of the engine. David gazed out the window, taking in the familiar streets, the houses, the trees he had passed every day without a second thought. Everything felt different now. Whiskers sat in his lap, purring softly, his little body warm against David's weak hands. He wasn't just a pet anymore, he was a lifeline. As the car pulled up in front of his house, David swallowed hard. The place looked just as he had left it, but something in his chest tightened. Would he be able to live here alone? Would he be strong enough? The neighbor helped him out of the car, steadying him as he took slow, careful steps toward the front door. His legs trembled with the effort, but he refused to stop. Whiskers trotted beside him, his tail flicking with every step. "You got this, David," the neighbor encouraged, unlocking the door for him. David took a deep breath and stepped inside. The familiar scent of home wrapped around him. The cozy couch, the bookshelf filled with old novels, the kitchen where he used to brew his morning coffee, it was all there, unchanged. But he had changed. He lowered himself onto the couch, his body still weak, still recovering. He hated feeling fragile, hated that simple movements took so much effort. Whiskers, as if sensing his frustration, jumped onto his lap and nudged his chin with his tiny head. David let out a shaky breath. "I know, buddy. One step at a time." The days passed and David settled into a new routine. Physical therapy was hard. Some mornings his body refused to cooperate. His right hand barely functioned and walking felt like an uphill battle. There were moments when frustration gripped him, when he wanted to scream at his own weakness. But Whiskers never let him fall too deep into despair. When David struggled to move his fingers, Whiskers sat beside him, rubbing against his hand until he tried again. When he felt exhausted, Whiskers curled up next to him, a steady presence, a reminder that he wasn't alone. And slowly, painfully, progress came. One day, David managed to lift a cup with his weak hand. A week later he took 5 unaided steps across the room. Then 10. Then 15. With each milestone, Whiskers celebrated in his own way, purring, rubbing against David's legs, or simply sitting beside him, watching with those knowing green eyes. "You're my little miracle worker," David murmured one evening, stroking Whiskers' fur as they sat together on the couch. Whiskers meowed in response, curling into him. David smiled. He had once thought he was saving Whiskers when he adopted him. But now he knew the truth. Whiskers had saved him. One evening there was a knock at the door. David, now able to walk without a cane most days, made his way over and opened it. It was the news crew. A reporter and a cameraman stood on his porch, smiling warmly. "David? We're with the local news. We heard about what your cat did, the 911 call. It's an incredible story." David chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah. I still don't believe it myself sometimes. We'd love to do a segment on Whiskers. People need to hear about this little hero." David glanced down at Whiskers, who was weaving between his legs, tail flicking curiously. "All right," David said with a smile. "But only if he gets top billing." A week later, David and Whiskers sat on the couch as their story aired on television. The footage showed Whiskers on David's lap, staring at the camera as if he understood the importance of the moment. The reporter spoke with excitement. "This is the remarkable story of Whiskers, the cat who dialed 911 and saved his owner's life. Experts say it's almost unheard of for a cat to do something like this, but Whiskers defied the odds. His quick actions got help just in time, giving his owner a second chance at life." David watched, his heart full as he stroked Whiskers' fur. People across the city, and even beyond, would know about the cat who had saved him. But none of them would ever truly understand what Whiskers meant to him. Not just a pet. Not just a hero. His best friend. That night, as David lay in bed, Whiskers curled up beside him, purring softly. For the first time in a long time, David felt truly at peace. He had been given a second chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. As he drifted to sleep, one last thought crossed his mind. Some heroes don't wear capes. Some have fur and tiny paws. David's story is a powerful reminder that love and loyalty can come from the most unexpected places. Whiskers wasn't just a pet, he was a lifesaver, a companion, and proof that animals understand more than we think. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more emotional and inspiring stories to life. And if you've ever had a pet who changed your life, share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. Paw prints. Some heroes wear capes, but some just have tiny paws. Paw prints.